I had heard rumours of Sᴛᴏ's aunt, long before I actually encountered her. Sᴛᴏ would remark, "My old aunt, you know," as if his relative might be a kind of cement to an entente cordiale. Sᴛᴏ and I were never in any sense intimate at school. I remained quite unmollified by advances on his side, unless it suited me to be magnanimous. Nonetheless, he did make advances, and on one occasion bestowed on me a pot of some mulberry-coloured jelly. In exuberance of my gratitude, I promised to spend the next half-term holiday with him at his aunt's. I had clean forgotten my promise, when 2 days before the holiday, he triumphantly reminded me. We reached his home by train. It was a whole-day holiday, and we were to sleep the night. We arrived at noon. Sᴛᴏ led me through the garden to show me his tadpole pond, and we loitered about a while, aimlessly. The first view I got of his aunt was when, at the summons of a distant gong, we approached the house to go in for luncheon. Sᴛᴏ suddenly came to a standstill. "Look out! There she is!" She was standing at an upper window, eyes fixed on us. She watched our advance without stirring, until, imperceptibly, her eyes raised and lost themselves in the distance, so that it was out of an assumed reverie that she appeared suddenly to awaken to our presence beneath her when we drew close to the house. "So, this is your friend, Mr. Smithers, I suppose?" "Withers, aunt," said Sᴛᴏ. "Well, it's much the same," she said, with eyes fixed on me. "Come in, Mr. Withers, and bring him along with you." She sat at the head of the table, facing the window, the light shining on her yellowish face, and on just such chocolate eyes as Sᴛᴏ's, except hers were half covered by unusually heavy lids. Above them was the wide expanse of a remarkable brow, beneath a strange, steep bank of hair. Miss Sᴛᴏ enjoyed an enormous appetite. Her example and a natural schoolboy voracity soon overcame my nervousness of her, allowing me to enjoy so rare a spread. Sᴛᴏ was singularly modest. The greater part of his meal consisted of raisins and almonds, which he nibbled surreptitiously, as if he found difficulty in swallowing. I don't mean that Miss Sᴛᴏ conversed with me. She merely scattered trenchant remarks and then twinkled a baited question. "And is Arthur a good boy at school, Mr. Withers? Is he first in his class?" "I think you're 8th, aren't you, Sᴛᴏ?" Sᴛᴏ moved his small pupils towards his aunt, but she continued to gaze at me. "Arthur will never make a brilliant scholar, I fear," she said, lifting a dexterously burdened fork to her mouth. After luncheon, she preceded me to my bedroom. It was a jolly little room. Over the washstand was a watercolour drawing, depicting a large eye with an intense spark of light on the pupil, and in illuminated lettering beneath was printed, "Thou God seest me." "But tell me, Smithers," she said, "why is Arthur so unpopular? You, I understand, are his only friend." Her eyes regarded me with such leaden penetration that I doubt if my face concealed the least thought from her. "But there," she added, "don't trouble to answer me. I never extort an answer. Boys are queer fish, and now perhaps you'd like to go into the garden. I should not be surprised if Arthur is skulking behind that hedge." He was. I saw his head come out and glance up at the windows. "Join him, Mr. Smithers. We shall meet again, I hope, at the tea table. The afternoon I spend in retirement." Whether or not, Sᴛᴏ and I had not been long engaged in riding round on an old horse we found in the meadow, before a figure appeared, walking along on the other side of the river, with a parasol lowered in our direction. Sᴛᴏ at once lost all nerve and toppled onto the grass. Was that your aunt, Sᴛᴏ? He nodded. Why didn't she take any notice of us? She never does, but she sees everything. How? Don't be talking of her, if you wouldn't mind. He lowered his voice. She's in league with the devil. You fellows don't realize what it is. I know I'm a bit close and all that, but so would you be if you had that old bag listening to every thought you think. Where's your pater? I said awkwardly. Dead. My mother, too. She's not my aunt, by right. I mean, she's not my mother's sister. My grandmother married twice. She gives you plenty of pocket money. Sᴛᴏ looked steadfastly at me. She can't give me what's mine. When I come of age, half of the whole lot will be mine. Sᴛᴏ's aunt greeted me with a heavy and protracted smile when we sidled sheepishly into the drawing-room. I hope Arthur has made you feel at home, she said, handing me a cup. He doesn't talk much to me, but then I'm an old woman. You must come again with us, draw him out of his shell, you old snail. She wagged her head at Sᴛᴏ. I confess I found her rather disquieting company. Sᴛᴏ and I ate our supper in silence and went upstairs. I had not been in bed long, I think, when I was wakened by a touch on my shoulder. And there was Sᴛᴏ's face in the candlelight. I'm sorry for waking you, he whispered. I never sleep before 12. Not here. What do you do then? Oh, read and listen. Listen? All you read in ghost stories, that's all rot. You can't see much with us, but you know they're there. This house swarms with them. He raised his candle to the little watercolour. Look at that. There's hundreds of eyes like that in this house. And even if God does see you, he takes precious good care you don't see him, and it's just the same with them. I know you're only guying me, I said angrily. But why is the house full of what you say? Tell me, you silly fool. He blinked at me calmly. She brings them. She's in league. You don't know. She as good as killed my mother. I know that. But it's not only her. She just sucks you dry, and that's what she'll do for me. She simply hates to see me alive. And then I saw his face change, saw his eyes suddenly drop and fix themselves on the door, and I, scarcely daring to breathe, sat watching him. Then he gave a kind of sigh. He jerked his thumb with meaningful eyes, and I knew he meant that his aunt had been listening at our door. Come on. I hesitated. I could see he was shivering, but it was no good showing the white feather now. Leaving the candle burning on the chair, we went out together. He descended the stairs, and I followed him, barefooted, along the thickly carpeted corridor. At the end stood a door ajar. Sᴛᴏ slowly pushed it open, and we stood together, looking into a great pool of darkness, out of which, lit by the feeble clearness of a nightlight, rose a vast bed. A heap of clothes lay on the floor. Somewhere a clock ticked huskily. And the bed! I stared warily in. It was empty. How are we going to get back without meeting her, I say? Answer me that. Oh, I wish you hadn't come here with us. He could hardly speak for his teeth chattering, and very distinctly in the hush that followed, I heard approaching a faint, unhurried rustle. Sᴛᴏ clutched my arm, dragged me across the room to a large cupboard, and drew the door close to on us. And presently, as I peeped out into the bedroom, waddled in that wonderful great head and body. I can see her now, her tied-up hair, her heavy lids above those slow, vigilant eyes. She just passed across my ken in the vague dusk, but the bed was out of sight. We waited, on and on, listening to the clock's muffled ticking. Not the ghost of a sound rose from the bed, and when it seemed we had been hours in hiding and were cramped, chilled and half suffocated, we crept out on all fours, with terror knocking at our ribs, and so back to the little candle-lit room. Once there, Seaton sat on a chair with closed eyes. "I'm going to bed," I said. "I've had enough of this foolery." So, with my candle in one hand, I took him under the arm and walked him down the corridor. His room was much dingier than mine, and littered with boxes and clothes. I huddled him into bed and turned to go. And suddenly, I can hardly explain it now, a kind of cold, deadly terror swept over me. I ran out of the room, blew out my candle, and buried my head under the bedclothes. When I awoke, sunlight was raying in on the bedpost. I got up, ashamed of the night's folly, dressed quickly, and went downstairs. Seaton's aunt was standing by the French window. She turned with a prodigious smile to inquire how I had slept, and in that mysterious way by which we learn each other's secret thoughts without a sentence spoken, I knew that she had followed every word and movement of the night before, and was triumphing over my affected innocence. We returned to school, Seaton and I, lavishly laden. I made no reference to the obscure talk we had had, and hadn't really believed half the stuff he had told me. I saw as little of him as I could after that. He left Gğᴏsᴛ rather abruptly. And I did not see him again until by chance we met one summer in the Strand, outside a cheap jeweller's shop. He chatted about our school, which he remembered only with dislike, and finally informed me that he had come to town to buy an engagement ring. "How's your aunt?" I inquired at last. She's aged a good deal." He eyed me fleetingly. "I dare say you heard that that we lost a good deal of money." And somehow, poor fellow, I knew that he had lied to me, that he did not possess a penny beyond what his aunt had squandered on his too ample pocket money. "Look here, Withers," he said as we said goodbye. "You're practically the only friend I have on earth, except Alice, and I'm not sure my aunt cares much about my getting married. She doesn't say so." He looked sidelong at the traffic. "What I was going to say is, would you mind coming down? You needn't stay the night, unless you please, but I should like you to meet meet Alice." I arrived one hazy midday at his out-of-the-way station, to find him sitting, waiting for me. We walked up the village street, and, as on my first visit, skirted the house together, making our way to the garden at the back. But now there was an air of slovenliness, where before all had been neat and methodical. He pulled out his watch. "I think perhaps it's nearly time for lunch." Seaton's aunt, a little to my relief, did not share our meal. Seaton carved the cold meat and dispatched a heaped-up plate by an elderly servant for his aunt's private consumption. I played him a dull and effortless game of chess, until at about 5 o'clock came the sound of a distant ring. Seaton effusively excused himself, and after some little while returned with a slim, dark, rather sallow girl of about 19, in a white gown and hat, to whom I was presented as his dear old friend and schoolfellow. We talked on in the pale afternoon light. We all seemed, if it were not my fancy, to be anxiously awaiting the appearance of someone who all but filled our collective consciousness. Seaton at last proposed a stroll in the garden. Alice walked between us. There was a curious, provocative reserve in that impassive and rather long face, a half-unconscious strength of character. And yet somehow I knew, I believe we all knew, that this walk, this discussion of their future plans was a futility. I had nothing to base such a cynicism on except a vague sense of oppression, the foreboding remembrance of the inert, invincible power in the background, to whom optimistic plans and love-making and youth are as chaff and thistledown. We came back, silent, in the last light. Seaton's aunt was there, under an old brass lamp. Her hair was as barbarously massed as ever. Her eyelids, I think, hung a little heavier in age over their inscrutable pupils. I made my bow. "In this short interval, Mr. Withers," she remarked amiably, "you have put off youth, put on the man. Dear me, how sad it is to see the young vanishing. Sit down. And Arthur, how do you think Arthur is looking?" She surveyed Arthur and Alice with overwhelming graciousness. "I think he looks in need of a change," I said deliberately. "A change, indeed, my dear Mr. Withers. Are we not all in need of a change in this fleeting world? And you?" She turned abruptly to Alice. "I hope you pointed out to Mr. Withers all my pretty bits." "We walked around the garden," said Alice. "It's a very beautiful evening." "Is it?" said the old lady, starting up violently. "Then on this very beautiful evening we will all go into supper." And throughout this prodigious meal she talked, mainly to me, with an occasional satirical courtesy to Alice. As for Seaton, her flashes of silence were for him. "What's that you're confiding to your plate, Arthur? Satirical boy. He laughs at his old aunt. He detests all sentiments. He whispers the most acid asides. Come, Alice, we will go and commiserate with each other on our sex. The choice of two evils, Mr. Smithers." I opened the door, and she swept out. I hesitated. "Look here, Seaton. Don't you think perhaps you may not treat your aunt quite in the right way? As one gets old, you know, a little allowance does no harm. I can't help thinking she thinks you don't care for her. She's been very decent to you, hasn't she?" "Decent? My God, I don't think you quite understand Withers. But I know." "Know what?" "I mean that I know what we see and hear is only the smallest fraction of what is. I know she lives quite out of this. She talks to you, but it's all a parlour game. She's not really with you, only pitting her outside wits against yours and enjoying the fooling. She's living on inside, on what you're rotten without. That's what it is. A cannibal feast. I tell you, Withers, she hates me. I thought you might understand, but there. So far as this is concerned, I'm as good as done. You wait." Seaton blew out the candles, and we groped our way to the drawing-room. There was a full moon shining in at the French window. Alice stood alone. "Where is she?" Seaton asked. Alice looked up. Their eyes met in a kind of instantaneous understanding, and the door immediately opened behind us. "Such a moon," said that voice. "A night for lovers, Mr. Withers. Get a shawl, my dear Arthur, and take Alice for a little promenade. Hasten, Romeo. My poor, poor Alice, how laggard a lover." Seaton returned with the shawl, and they drifted out into the moonlight. My companion turned to me and suddenly twisted her face into such a convulsion of contemptuous amusement that I could only stare blankly in reply. "Dear, innocent children," she said, with inimitable unctuousness. I could scarcely see her eyes under their penthouse lids. "And now, tell me, what do you think of my new niece?" "She's charming." "A brunette?" "I prefer dark women." "And why?"
Consider, Mr. Withers. Dark hair, dark eyes, dark night, dark grave, dark.
Perhaps the climax would have thrilled Sᴛᴏ, but I was too thick-skinned. I suppose it isn't the actual darkness one admires, it's the contrast of the skin and the colour of the eyes, and their shining, just as, I blundered on, just as you only see the stars in the dark. As for death and the grave, I don't suppose we shall much notice that.
How very interesting, came the smooth answer. I see you are a philosopher, Mr. Withers.
She rose from her stool. Arthur and his sweetheart were returning along the dewy path.
You will take pity on me again, I hope. Now that my nephew is going to leave me, I shall be a very lonely old woman. Shall I not, Arthur?
I don't think so, Sᴛᴏ said in a strange voice.
He means, Mr. Withers, he means that I shall have memory for company, heavenly memory, the ghost of other days. Sentimental boy. And did you enjoy the music, Alice? Continued the horrible creature. You billers and cooers, I've been listening to such flattery, such confessions.
She rolled her eyes at me, shrugged her shoulders at Alice, and gazed an instant stonily into her nephew's face. I held out my hand.
Good night, Mr. Withers. Come again soon.
She thrust out her cheek at Alice, and we all three filed slowly out of the room. We walked without speaking up the dusty village street. At the fork of the high road I said goodbye, but I had hardly taken more than a dozen paces when a sudden impulse seized me. "Sᴛᴏ!" I called. He turned in the moonlight. "If by any chance, you should care to spend a week in town between this and the day, I should be delighted to see you." "Thank you," he said. "Thank you, Withers. Immensely." And so we parted. I left Sᴛᴏ and his marriage, and even his aunt, to themselves in my memory, and scarcely gave them a thought, until one day I was walking up the Strand again, and passed the jeweller's shop. I cannot say why, but a vivid recollection returned to my mind of our meeting, and of how suppressed Sᴛᴏ had seemed. He must be married by now, and I had not sent a word of congratulation, nor the ghost of a wedding present. On the other hand, I pleaded with myself, I had had no invitation. I paused at the corner of Trafalgar Square, and at the bidding of one of those caprices that seized one occasionally, I ran after a green bus and found myself bound on a visit I had not in the least foreseen. The colours of autumn were all over the village when I arrived. I walked quickly to the house and rang the bell. The elderly servant who answered my inquiry informed me that Miss Sᴛᴏ was at home. "Might I, do you think, have Mr. Arthur's address?" I said. She looked at me with astonishment. "I will tell Miss Sᴛᴏ," she said after a pause. She showed me into the drawing-room, and I sat down and waited. At last the door opened, and the great face I had once known peered round at me. It was enormously changed, mainly, I think, because the old eyes had failed, and so a kind of stillness and darkness lay over its wrinkled pallor. "Who is it?" she asked. I explained myself and told her the occasion of my visit. She groped her way to a chair.
"You have come to see my nephew?"
"Not necessarily to see him, only to hear how he is, and Mrs. Sᴛᴏ. I'm afraid my silence must have appeared—"
"He hasn't noticed your silence," croaked the old voice. "Besides, there isn't any Mrs. Sᴛᴏ."
"Ah, then, how is Miss Outram?"
"She's gone into Yorkshire," answered Sᴛᴏ's aunt.
"And Arthur too?" She did not reply, but simply sat blinking at me. "You must find it very lonely, Miss Sᴛᴏ, with Arthur away."
"I don't look to flesh and blood for my company," she said sourly,
and her eyes groped over my vacant, disconcerted face.
I dare say my nephew told you a good many taradiddles in his time. Oh, yes, a good many, eh? He always was a liar. What now did he say of me?
I have a poor memory, Miss Seaton, I said coldly.
Why? I haven't.
Where is Arthur? I asked. And then, suddenly, our eyes for the first time really met. In some indescribable way, out of that thick-lidded obscurity, a far small something stooped and looked out at me. She muttered something quite inarticulately, rose and hobbled to the door. I stood and looked out on the long-neglected garden. Dusk began to gather. The last birds had ceased to sing, and not a sound was to be heard in the house. I waited, on and on, and as darkness drew down, a feeling of the utmost unease and disquietude came over me. I determined to wait no longer, drew open the door and groped my way through to the front of the house. My fingers were on the latch of the outer door when I heard a stirring in the darkness above the hall. I looked up and saw the huddled old figure looking down on me.
Arthur? Arthur?
Whispered an inexpressibly peevish voice.
Is that you? Is that you, Arthur?
The question horribly startled me. No conceivable answer occurred to me.
Oh,
the voice croaked.
It is you, is it? That disgusting man. Go away out. Go away out.
Hesitating no longer, I caught open the door and ran out into the garden. I found myself half up the village street before I stopped running. The local butcher was in his shop. I crossed the road and casually asked if Mr. Arthur Seaton still lived with his aunt at the big house. "Dead and buried these 3 months or more, young Mr. Seaton," he replied, "and just before he was to be married." We looked intelligently into each other's faces, but not one of the many questions in my mind could I put into words. And again I paused irresolutely a few paces further on. It was not, I fancy, merely a foolish apprehension of what the butcher might think that prevented my going back to see if I could find Seaton's grave in the churchyard. There was precious little use in pottering about in the dark, merely to discover where he was buried. And yet I felt uneasy. My rather horrible thought was that so far as I was concerned, one of his extremely few friends, he had never been much better than buried in my mind.